Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to the CDR Swiss webinar on CDR funding, markets and policy with a focus on international developments. Today we'll have two experts as speakers here, Eve Damme from Climate Principles and Louis Uso from Climeworks, who I'll introduce in just a second. And with this, I will briefly show you the schedule for today. We started with a welcome note. I will briefly introduce the Swiss carbon removal platform as well. And then we'll hand over to Eve Damme, who is the founder and managing director of Climate Principles, with her input. And after this, we'll have some time for direct questions and answers, and then hand over to Louis Uso from climeworks, who is working there as a climate policy manager in the same procedure. And then we still have hopefully some time left until 6 o'clock here at Zurich time for some more Q&A and questions. So the Swiss Carbon Removal Platform is a project initiated by the Risiko-Dialog Foundation. That's what I'm working for. It's a small non-profit organization based in Zurich, Switzerland, that's dedicated to help society to better deal with broad aspects of a range of risks and societal topics regarding risk topics. And one of those is obviously climate change. And since 5 years, we've been involved a lot in stakeholder engagements and dialogues all around carbon dioxide removal methods, in the application mainly in Switzerland. And we started a Swiss carbon removal platform last year with the aim to bring together stakeholders who are active or want to be active in the field of CDR in Switzerland and for Switzerland, but with a really broad range of stakeholders, not just the industry or just research or just policymakers, but to bring everyone together, including NGOs and also administration. Here you can see the logos of our current members. It's more than 40 members since we started last year. You can also check out our website if you want to learn more, or click on the links to visit the sites of the single members. And with this, I'm excited to introduce to you Eve Damme, our first speaker. And also welcome to Louis Uso, who I'll introduce afterwards. So Eve Damme, as I said before, is the head of Climate Principles, and this is a climate policy advisory based in Brussels. Today, Eva is joining us from Lisbon, and she's specialized in European and international climate policy and has been working in the field since 2004. Among other fields, she has been working for the Estonian National Administration, but also the European Commission and the Estonian representation in the EU. But for now, let's have Louis Uso. I will quickly introduce Louis. He's the climate policy manager at Climeworks, a direct air capture company based in Zurich, Switzerland. That's also from where Louis is joining us today. And Louis has been with Climeworks since 2017, and his work focuses on EU politics, among others. It's Article 6 Greenhouse Gas Protocol and accounting frameworks. So we're very much looking forward to your contribution.
Many thanks, Samuel, also for the invitation and the opportunity to speak here. It's a great pleasure and looking forward to many questions. Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here and speak about Climeworks. And also how we see not just the way forward, but also how we got where we are currently at and what we actually do. Maybe I keep the Climeworks intro rather short because I think most of the participants know the company and the technology quite well. So in a nutshell, what we do is we develop modular CO2 collectors that can capture CO2 from the atmosphere. We do so in a process that allows for mass production, that allows for utilization of sustainable energy sources as the sole energy sources that we want to incorporate in our technologies, and obviously this is resulting in a low carbon footprint with less than 10% of life cycle emissions. That basically means that for each ton of CO2 that we capture from the air and sequester, less than 10% need to be deducted based on a life cycle assessment. What is also worthwhile mentioning here is that what we do can be done quite efficiently, and in terms of the land footprint that we have. So our main plant that is been running in Iceland for roughly a year now, the Orca plant, does the work of roughly 1,000 trees on the same land area. And speaking of that plant, the Orca plant, what we call our living proof, it's the largest DAC and storage facility operative globally. It has been commissioned as of September last summer, and has a nominal capacity of 4,000 tons of CO2 per year, which in terms of global emissions being in the gigaton range is minor, so to say, but in terms of getting a company to be able to capture 4,000 tons of CO2 per year, that's been a major step, and I'm looking forward to guide you through what made this happen in the following 20 minutes. The plant is located in beautiful Iceland. It's located near Reykjavik, actually. It's based on a site that is co-located to a geothermal power plant, where we also obtain the energy from. So it's 100% geothermal energy used within the plant. And then obviously the CO2 that we capture is then subsequently stored underground with our storage partner, a company called Carbfix, an Icelandic company. And what they are doing is to mineralize the CO2 underground, where it turns into rocks, basically. So we have a lot of calcite, but also other rocks such as Organised and magnesite, depending on local circumstances in the reservoir. So what you can see here is basically the three pieces put together. So climeworks, we capture the CO2 from the air, and then we hand it over to Carbfix, and Carbfix is then injecting the CO2 spurged with water. So we inject in Iceland in a dissolved state, and this allows for a really fast uptake and a really fast modification into minerals. So it's a mineralization process that is really effective in the Icelandic region, given that Iceland is a rather young country in terms of geological timescales and many reactive metals, and thus a highly efficient process. And on the last picture, what you see here is a drill core, basically from such a reservoir where CO2 has been turned into stone. So we captured it from the air, handed it over to Carbfix, and they introduced it into these geologic reservoirs. And in that stone that you can see there, the white spots, typically white as its calcite, is carbonated air captured CO2. And continuing with, in a nutshell, why we do direct air capture, why it's worth speaking about these technologies is, as Yves will surely outline in a greater extent after me now, is that it's part of the global tools needed to reach the climate targets as specified in Paris, and now confirmed every year. And with every IPCC report, it's getting more and more clear that we basically have to do three things. So first, we have to defossilize our economy, our agriculture as well, and really get down to as low emissions as possible. This is mainly done through conventional mitigation technologies. So the typicals here are solar and wind, but then also depending on the context, you have geothermal sources, you have biomass, you have many ways to also be more energy efficient, so that the absolute number of emission just decreases because we use the energy we have a lot smarter. But no matter what we do, I think it's pretty clear by now that there is this scientific, but also I think policy consensus by now that there will be sectors, there will be activities that are really hard to abate. And therefore we have to incorporate carbon dioxide removal or net negative emissions is something else that follows thereafter, but really to get to a net zero balance of CO2 emissions, we have to remove unavoidable emissions. And yeah, the graph here, it's indicative. So the volumes here, we see that it's based on a IPCC report from 2018. I think the newest contribution has a bit less, or the median scenarios show a bit less removals absolutely needed, but we still speak of removals in the gigaton range that are needed by 2050. And then also importantly and implicit in this figure is that we have already emitted quite a lot of carbon emissions into the atmosphere, and that we have basically built up a carbon debt that we have to mitigate and address. And there is no other technologies than active carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere that can really realize a carbon take back, basically. And in the following, I really want to focus on how we got to where we are currently at, and provide a brief outlook on the company's history, and then also speak about what is the current space and what is the current challenges that we face at climeworks, and how we plan to address them, before giving a brief outlook on what we believe in will be the future for carbon dioxide removal, both in terms of policy developments, but also then market structures and overview thereof. Going into the company history and how we started, or how climeworks started, and how we got to really the Orca plant, which is our poster child of technology development as of today. climeworks was funded in 2009 as an ETH spin-off. So our two funders, Jan Wurzbacher and Christoph Gebald, they both did a PhD at ETH Zurich, and even before that in their masters and bachelors, I think they specialized in clean energy solutions, and also then saw that basically for capturing CO2 from the air is essential, looking at, for example, the aviation industry, where a sustainable feedstock is needed, and thus stay fully engaged with the topic from the get-go, to say, and started the company in 2009. The company consists of a rather small team of less than 10 people for quite some time. So within the first 3 years, it was all about making it a technology that is tested also not just in the lab, but can be transferred from these lab scales into more climate relevant spheres. So going from milligrams CO2 captured into some grams and then kilograms captured from the atmosphere, and developing industrial pathways to capture CO2 from the air. And by 2014, it became clear that the concept that climeworks incorporates is a modular concept. So by then, we developed the first modular CO2 collector, built in a way that it allows for mass production, and built in a way that it allows for subsequent technology improvements that can be done on a smaller scale and improved thereafter. By 2015, I think the climate landscape was still a bit different, and we had a lot of focus on pathways to defossilize the transportation sector. So we had relevant partnerships with car manufacturers, Audi, for example, but also going into the field of air-to-fuels plants, so where CO2 from the air has been synthesized to produce a e-kerosene, as we call it today, synthetic air fuels that can be used as drop-in fuels in the aviation sector. And then by 2017, there has been the development of the world's first commercial direct air capture plant. Commercial in the sense that the CO2 that we have captured and still capture until today at this location is used in a nearby greenhouse from a local food manufacturer, actually, where the CO2 is used to help plants grow. So there is tomatoes growing, there is spinach growing just now over winter, and now, those have been the applications that we looked at in the early days or earlier days, because obviously what we have with the technology has been the ability to capture CO2 from the air and use it as a feedstock in relevant industries. But then I think by 2019, also with the shift and the importance of the Paris Agreement and then especially the special report on 1.5 degrees, it became even more clear that the main application of direct air capture will be in terms of delivering an approach to realize carbon dioxide removal. So we started working on a carbon dioxide removal service that we made available to individuals. So it has been and still is part of climeworks philosophy that we need a big movement basically to realize this technology scale up that we now foresee. And each and every one is meaningful there too. And so it has been one of the key things that we have done by then to really allow for anyone basically to engage with the company and become part of our journey. In 2020, we had a big private investment into our company and thus also the technology of $110 million that allowed for a subsequent build of the Orca plant that you have seen priorly, which is the first large-scale direct air capture and storage plant, and as mentioned, located in Iceland. As a summary, a bit of a crowded slide, but what we see here is that we have focused our operations really in Europe and various places. We have more than 15 facilities that we have developed since 2009. Going from locations as far as Iceland to southern Italy in Troia, with looking at different applications. In Troia, we produced a e-methane or synthetic methane that was introduced into the power grid. In Iceland, we realized carbon dioxide removal. And in Switzerland, in Hinwil, that the small picture that you see there, that has become one of the key pictures to feature direct air capture. That's obviously the Capricorn plant that is used for fertilizing plants in the greenhouse. Over time, we have also grown quite heavily as a team. Currently, we stand at more than 190 climb workers, and with an ongoing growth in the company. So if you go over to our webpage and go to the careers page, I think it's more than 40 open positions at the moment. So we really plan to not just scale the technology, but also scale the team that works for this technology to be scaled. What has also been significant and just communicated, I think, a month back now, is that we have had another substantial and the world's biggest investment into the company once more, with a new finance round that brought another 600 million to the company that we'll once again use to build and operate new plants, bigger plants, and expand the hours of operational experience and projects that we have. By now, we have more than 100,000 hours of operational experience, and all of this based on a low life cycle emissions. And yeah, with that, I also want to provide an outlook on where we go now. So what we see here is really a shift also in the way we operate. So we started looking more globally, and this closely follows the policy projects and the enabling infrastructure around direct air capture that we see. So we see here that we are now expanding towards the US based on relevant funds spoken in there. So there are projects from the Department of Energy and Carbon Management in the US that really want to realize and help funding the sector by investing $3.5 billion US. And obviously, we are looking at these projects in the US. We are expanding our portfolio towards Oman, just in terms of getting new carbon sinks. Storing CO2 in peridotite is quite an effective way. Looking also into more European projects, Northern Lights is one of the key things that we see as emerging and also a storage site that we quite like. Summarizing this, I think what were the early enablers for climeworks? Quickly here, I think one of the key things to mention is that climeworks is an ETH Zurich spin-off. So we have relied heavily on the ETH Zurich infrastructure and early stage support from the university. We have really made opportunities of regional champions. So we had venture capital from Swiss stakeholders. We had innovation funding from Swiss banks and Swiss stakeholders and regional stakeholders engaging with the idea. So the greenhouse I talked about is really effective, not just in terms of getting a first project, but really being supportive of the idea and realizing projects that don't look that effective in terms of a mere business plan at first sight. But also the public opportunities within academic support. So we had funding from the Bundesamt für Energie, we had funding from Horizon 2020 projects, and the general international research community is key to climeworks success so far. Copernicus is another project, Store and Go, another project where we have really relied on public funds. I think what is then emerging is that the past years has also shown that there is private and individual support, as mentioned, the pioneers that are important, but also these strategic alliances with globally active players. Coca-Cola is one of them, and also Audi, who has been key to the success of climeworks. And then we have the international recognition, media interest, and policy papers, and more and more. But I think what is also interested here is the most dedicated team, I would say, of people engaged with direct air capture, and that made the success that we have earned so far. With that, I want to speak more about what we need now and what our plans are. So I think we have a technology roadmap that you can see here. So you see that by doing ORCA, we have realized 4,000 tons nominally captured each year, and we plan to do a 10x scale-up factor over the next years, and doing so every 2 to 3 years. So we are heavily engaged with planning ORCA's successor that is likely to be hosted also in Iceland, but then going globally and really doing these 10x scale-ups every 2 or 3 years. And I think what you can also see here on the slide is that the capacities for ORCA, for example, they are fully sold out. And with our next plant, the Mammoth plant, there is capacity available, but only from 2027 onwards. So we see that the market already today is structured by a high supply, or is supply limited rather than demand limited. But I think what is more important and what we really need is dedication and transparency and awareness of what CDR can do. So with that, I have 3 things in mind. I think the most important thing is a clear target setting at first. So 2 examples here, we have the European Green Deal or the European Climate Law, and then also on the private side, we have the Science Based Target Initiative with the Net Zero standard. And what both of them have in common is that they feature a clear role for carbon dioxide removal. So we evade limiting factors such as discussions around a moral hazard by clearly separating the 2 and establishing a role for CDR that can be acted on. What's also needed is transparency, and not just the target, but that you make what you have specified in your target visible and accountable. So here also a few initiatives, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, a voluntary standard, is working on the first accounting scheme for removals. And then we also have the eligibility on compliance markets and counting for CDR in early political niche markets, I'd say, that are key and needed as of today in order to go from these 4,000 tons towards climate relevant scales. And last, but certainly not least, is really the certification around what CDR stand for, what are the standards that we need. And here you see there is, for example, the gold standard working on a carbon removal expert group. We have the verified carbon standard Vera that is doing work as regards certification of removals within CCS Plus initiative. We have the priority within the European Commission to establish a certification or carbon removal certification mechanism in the EU. And all of these 3 things will help guide through. Here you see a short case study of how this is done. Science-based target is really clear on the role of removals and clearly separates them from other more conventional offsets type. And this is needed in order to really get a dedicated means of funding, but also deployment of the technologies. because that's basically what we need. So we need a lot of investment, and where we are now, and here the analogy to the wind and solar industries, where we have seen that early stage investment and the belief in these technologies through public programs and public policies had the power to unlock this next scale up step and drove demand and reduced cost accordingly. Summarizing these current needs, I'll have 4 things. So I think first we need a better external understanding of what net zero means and the associated role of removals therein. This goes into clear targets, and with the targets follows a clear framework how to incorporate removals within the global economies and respective policies. And I think economies is set as a plural by purpose, because I think it will really need to go to sector by sector analysis, country by country analysis on what role removals have. But what is clear that for net zero, every industry or every country basically will feature some form and some amount of removals. And this should translate into clear signals. So we need early stage CDR niche markets or direct funding. So public procurement is in the talks as of today. In the US, there are talks on respective bills. Also in Switzerland or Europe in general, this has been ideas that have been seen in communications. But what we also need on the more technological side is really a deployment, and by deploying these technologies on larger scales, we have to learn by doing. And this is enabled by public as well as private entities and partnerships thereof. 2 examples here from the US context, obviously the direct air capture hubs sponsored by the DOE, but then we also have the private frontier advanced market commitment, where basically a set of private corporates have come together to build up a fund that really signals whatever you produce, we will buy. And this will hopefully result in this learning and buying down the cost curve. And what it also brings is an establishment of an ecosystem of activities and the respective supply chains. For the future and what we expect in terms of the policy landscape, I quite like this figure here, because it's an updated marginal abatement cost curve that has been done by EDF in a US context, looking only at net zero energy systems, or only, it's a lot, but in terms of not all greenhouse gases, but just the energy sector. And what we see therein is really that direct air capture features twice, once for direct air capture and storage, and then second for zero carbon fuels. I think it's an oxymoron. It's low carbon fuels or negative emission or near carbon neutral fuels. They still contain a lot of carbon, but carbon captured from the air. But what we see in these curves and how we have to think about the technologies is really that the curve, they will have different structures based on the countries and also based on the scope of the assessment. So if we included agriculture, for example, the curve would shift. And what is thus needed is really this country level analysis and the country level target setting in order to deploy DAC in a meaningful way and according to its merits. So what you see here as well is that we have roughly 10% of remaining emissions within the energy sectors depicted here. What we also see is that post direct air capture, there is nothing to follow. So we have really not much else there, and DAC is acting as the backstop price, basically, to abate carbon. This can be enabled by moving towards a more effective and a carbon removals market. So what you see here is that we have, based on the voluntary carbon market, a really distorted market that is mixing many things and not really fit for purpose to scale removals. So what you see here is that more than 95% of offsets currently traded, they are not real removals. And so this, in line with principles, for example, offered by Oxford University, needs to be translated on the voluntary carbon market first. In policy circles and compliance markets, what is important as well is really this graph here that comes from a ICAP study looking at how to integrate carbon removals into a compliance setting. And here we see that we have several options. And as of today, we cannot say which option will make the race, basically. Obviously, climeworks favors one more than the other. But what we see here is that we really need to think more about how to incorporate removals into the climate policy sphere and what works best. And so from our perspective, there can be ways to go with the Model A or Model B, where we have a disconnected market for removals especially, or a market that is regulated by governments and thus also meaningfully implemented. But what we try to avoid by all cases is an integrated market where removals, offset and conventional offsets that look at reductions and avoidance credits are all mixed together, resulting in a mitigation deterrence, as some people call it. But then, yeah, how this is being operationalized is subject to current discussions and really just the outcome of the next 1 or 2 years, I hope. And with that, I'm happy to receive your questions.
Thank you very much, Louis, for this practitioner's perspective from the direct air capture perspective on carbon dioxide removal in practice and in policy. The participants are now welcome to raise their hands. We'll have maybe 1 or 2 short questions now that are very direct, and then hand over to Eve that we can still have some time for an open discussion in the end. Since I don't see any questions, I've got one question regarding the direct air capture perspective on energy policies. As you said, direct air capture has a very small footprint on land use, but of course the bottleneck is renewable energy supply to really have it keep the efficiency, carbon efficiency up. And on Iceland, we have a bit perfect setting for that. What challenges or also needs for integrating this in energy policies in countries where the energy mix is less comfortable? Also, there's maybe trade-offs or target conflicts, so to say, between different uses of energy in the mitigation context.
Yes, that's a good and highly relevant question. I think what is the main trade-off with direct air capture is the energy consumption, and it's by no chance that we have placed our current facilities in Iceland where renewable energy is really abundant. But looking at future projects and project development there too, but also the political side of the energy regulation that can go to direct air capture, I think there's 2 things that are important. And the first is that we need to think as a project developer in terms of a system. So we know that renewables are variable. So for example, it could be that we design a system that can use excess energy when there is. This has been done already with projects relying 100% on solar. So that's not a challenge per se, but obviously the more we scale, the more energy we consume. And that translates into the second aspect, which is the policy around that. So we see similar discussions with hydrogen production, for example, where you have quite a few restrictions on what energy you use, where it comes from, how far away it is. And these are ongoing debates in European parliaments, in national legislations that we closely follow, because we have 2 objectives, and the first here is really to scale the capacity that we can offer, and thus also need a lot of energy. But the second is to do so in a climate positive way, so we are aware of other energy uses. And so this is part of our daily thinking, that we try to incorporate these 2 options or balance the trade-off as good as possible, because what we cannot, or what we don't need today basically is another barrier in terms of we are not allowed to use energy at certain times, for example, or have a Volllastbegrenzung and the like. So this would really hinder the upscale of our technologies, and why or what we do here is really the deciding. So the technology can go basically anywhere. And our project development team is looking at exactly these sites where this conflict can be overcome as much as possible.
Okay, thank you. We'll take 2 more questions. I'll ask you to try to be short in the answering, which is of course not always easy. So the first question is from the chat. It says, "Hi Louis, could you comment on the development of carbon removal pricing versus longevity of removals?"
Yeah, so the key aspect here is permanence, and with permanence, it's meant for how long is CO2 stored. And we strongly believe that the longer the storage, and climeworks can offer storage in geological timeframes, the higher the justification for high prices as well. And we don't want to say that shorter term storage is not meaningful, but it's just complete different categories. And we are doing relevant policy work to outline that and make that visible, because then we speak of different categories that each deserve their own price.
Thank you. And the second comment will come from participant Richard. Can you speak?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes,
I
perfect.
can hear you.
Good. Yes, thank you. Richard Lewis at Delta Energy Capital. Thanks, Lewis. That was a really excellent talk. When I've been following climeworks over the last few years, I've been surprised and impressed at how many buyers are stepping up to pay something like $800, I think, dollars a ton for carbon removal. How do you see that demand curve developing? How deep is it, and how many ultimately millions of tons are you going to be able to sell before you have to bring the cost of production significantly down?
Well, I think the two go hand in hand. The more early stage buyers we have, the more facilities we can build, and the faster prices will come down. So that's obviously our strategy and what we build on with that. But what I think is that we are seeing a shift now, or my daily work is shifting from voluntary buyers really into looking at how can we enable a policy framework where this is not just a voluntary means of a company like Microsoft or Stripe that don't have so many emissions themselves, but really integrated into the sectors that are hard to abate. And my opinion here is that this will best go via policies.
Okay, thanks for the question, also for the answer, Louis, and thanks again for the presentation. We'll have you back in the end, where we still have some time, and with this, we will hand over to Eve.
Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone, from my side as well. My name is Eve Damme, and I'm a managing director at Climate Principles. I have worked on climate policy since 2004 now, and mostly it has been on the EU and international climate policy. So this is going to be the focus of this presentation, but of course the angle is going to be the carbon removal. I'll talk about policy, but as part of the policy are also the carbon markets, so that obviously will also come up. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I will give kind of a quick overview. I hope it will inspire some good questions, and then looking forward to the conversation that we'll have afterwards. And of course, thank you for the Swiss Carbon Removal Platform for the invitation. I will start with the recent IPCC report. Because the Working Group 3 contribution that was recently published has a very important new element in it when it talks about the role of CDR more broadly. So we have, and Louis actually mentioned similar things already in this presentation, but I wanted to highlight this near-term role for CDR that hasn't really gotten that much attention yet. So it can also further reduce the net emission levels on our pathway towards net zero. And And the important part it plays is that the stakeholders who are working on CDR and working and doing advocacy around the policies and working with policymakers can kind of add this to their toolbox of the messages to spread around, because it's coming from a obviously very very highly respected publication. Another element from the same report I wanted to show was the share of G20 countries that have different sectoral policy instruments in place. You can see how it has changed over time, and one element that is missing here, and that the report also mentions that is missing, is carbon removal policies. So what we will need to see is the vast appearance of carbon removal policies. They might be separate policies or also within sectoral policies, but we need to see how these also increasing in share, at least in the scale that we see for other types of policies on the slides. I will now continue more on the international perspective, and then I will move from that to the European perspective. When we talk about the Paris Agreement, then nationally determined contributions is usually what comes to mind when we talk about the countries' climate pledges and what they plan to do under the Paris Agreement to help achieve its targets. And interestingly, these most well-known pledges don't really include much on carbon removal. And that's for an obvious reason, because these are kind of midterm targets. They are currently, so the NDCs that were published in 2020 or 2021, there was a bit of delay because COP26 was delayed by a year. These are looking at 2030. And not that many countries are actually thinking about carbon removal yet when they are putting together their plans for 2030. It's rather something that is seen for, maybe 2040 and definitely 2050. And the important thing to bear in mind is that this will start changing, because Paris Agreement introduced this 5-year ratcheting mechanism for NDCs. So every 5 years, countries will need to submit new or updated NDCs. And next time around, that will happen in 2025. And as we go through these 5-year cycles, we should start seeing more and more role of carbon removal also within these NDCs. Because 2025 targets are going to be 2035 or beyond. In 2030, the targets are going to be 2040 or beyond. So that should start playing a role. But of course, we should bear in mind that these documents are quite general. And so we would want to see carbon removal methods there, but then we also want to see it in more depth in the national implementation plans for these NDCs. Another set of documents under the Paris Agreements that the countries have been preparing are long-term strategies. We currently have, I think, 51 of those strategies submitted to the UN Framework Convention Secretariat, and vast majority of these do include carbon removal, because now we talk about mid-century, and here obviously to achieve net zero, the role of carbon removal is quite widely recognized. But here we're talking about at the event of the Swiss Carbon Removal Platform, and we know that the Swiss long-term strategy is a great example how to highlight the role of carbon removal in the long-term strategy and how to be specific about it. However, there are many long-term strategies that are not very clear at all. Some of them don't have any specific goals, even some just highlight a few pathways or scenarios, but don't choose which one to go for. So even if we don't talk about carbon removal, there is a lot of uncertainty. But when we talk about carbon removal, mostly the most widely long-term strategies refer to the nature-based CDR methods. If you talk about those methods that also use technology, BECS is most widely used. It's probably also for a reason that it's just more known or it was more known at the time where the strategies were submitted, because some of them were submitted a couple of years ago or even before. And there are some strategies that already also refer to some other types of CDR methods. But this is so on one side, it's very useful to have these national strategies that show the role of carbon removal. But what we would want to have is more clarity and also more widened take on carbon removal, and more specific on the different types of methods that are going to be used. So as these strategies are submitted, and we have also seen some of them updated, that is something to bear in mind and look for, because it provides this certainty and this kind of general overall framework that then the national policies will need to start working towards, right? If we talk about climate policy, then one part of it is carbon pricing, and one subset of carbon pricing are carbon markets. And in the context of carbon markets, I just also recently wrote a blog post about it. We can talk about voluntary carbon markets and compliance markets. In the voluntary market, currently carbon removal does play a role, but it's relatively small. And it's most of it is, Louis also mentioned in his presentation, there is quite a bit there that is not very high quality. On the more durable carbon removal credits on the voluntary market side, there is definitely a challenge with the supply, and there's a lot of demand. But it's clear that the interest in this is growing, and when we talk about carbon markets in general, voluntary markets is where the innovation and the flexibility lies, and they're also growing quite steeply at the moment. But voluntary markets, if you compare the sizes, you know, like 0.1 or 2% of the size of compliance markets at the moment. And compliance markets are mostly made up right now of emissions trading systems where almost all of them don't include currently removals at all. And the largest of the emissions trading systems is the EU's trading system, that is 90% of the whole market size of compliance markets, and that definitely does not at the moment include removals. And well, there are conversations happening around it, and we don't know whether and when it would actually include removals. And there's the other part of compliance markets, the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, that's creating the Paris Agreement compliance markets. And this is still emerging, and this very clearly includes both emission reductions and removals. It's just that it's still appearing, it's still emerging, it's not yet there, and it will take time for it to grow and start playing a more important role. Another element to bear in mind in this context is that over time, there's this expectation that the voluntary markets will start converging with compliance markets, especially due to the rules that have been introduced under the Article 6, but there are still some details there to be ironed out. If we zoom out and look at the longer time trajectory, then it's clear that over time, carbon markets will become carbon removal markets. This will need to happen for us to make it to the net zero and then net negative territory. Of course, carbon markets, it's not panacea, it's not the one tool that makes everything happen, but it can contribute because countries' capabilities and their potential to use different CDR methods is very different, and being able to use markets just makes a lot of sense to facilitate. Now, coming to Europe. In the European climate law, we have, well, first of all, and Louis also mentioned, you know, it's the law that we have in place, and it's a great success story to have it. So this is not something we're discussing, we already have it. It has 3 distinct elements that are important for removals. One is the 2030 targets and the fact that it's actually a separate target for emission reductions and removals. And we would like to see more of that happening all around the world, the separate targets for emissions and removals. The slightly negative part of it is that the removals that are capped at these 225 million tons at the moment, these only include removals from land use change, and forestry regulation. So it doesn't include any type of more novel removals, for example, those from direct air capture. Then we have the climate neutrality target itself, which very clearly indicates the need for removals because we will have the residual emissions that we will need to balance. And post 2050, the EU shall aim to achieve negative emissions, which again provides this certainty that there's going to be even higher and more increasing need for removals. In the upcoming EU legislation, well, there is actually a lot of that, because the Fit for 55 package that was published last summer includes a long list of policies that are going to be either introduced or revised. And many of them have either direct or indirect relevance for carbon removal. And so to cover that, it would basically it would mean another presentation on that exact topic. But what I would say here today is that, for example, the major sectoral climate policies of the EU, the emissions trading system and effort sharing regulation, which covers sectors that are outside the emissions trading system, in the context of both of these revisions, the idea of including certain types of removals has come up, especially in the context of the European Parliament and the amendments that have been put forward there. I'm not sure whether this time around we actually end up including removal specifically in any of them, but this round of revision. I'm quite sure that next time the emission trading system or effort sharing regulation are going to be revised, we will be in a different place in terms of CDR governance in Europe, and the conversation around removals is going to be different, and it's more likely that there are going to be certain types of removals included here or there, or certain type of fungibility created. And the most important development in the context of EU CDR policy is the upcoming proposal on EU's carbon removal certification mechanism. So this is a major development because we have this huge gap in climate mitigation policy in Europe. And well, that's not only in Europe, it's actually more broadly globally. We just don't have much policy and regulation in place for many of these more novel CDR methods. And for example, if we're not able to quantify them and verify the impact, it's also very difficult to start incentivizing the deployment. So we need to fix it. And this certification mechanism hopefully will manage to do it. And what will it do? It will establish the main principles, criteria, and requirements for the certification. It will not include detailed methodologies or protocols when it's published. That's going to be kind of the next stage of it. And this work is expected to feed into the voluntary carbon markets, and it's also clearly relevant for the compliance markets. And the Commission has also openly said that the removals will need to be more integrated in the EU climate policy. What I haven't yet seen is a compelling explanation how the certification will be kind of feeding into both in a way that doesn't lead to any double counting. But I'm really looking forward to following how it processes. This slide is just listing the short-listed CDR methods that are being considered under the certification mechanism. It doesn't mean that all of these will end up already in the proposal itself, but this is currently what is being looked at. And if we look at the timeline itself, then December last year, we got this Commission communication that's covered carbon farming, it covered industrial carbon removal, and also the carbon removal certification, kind of indicating the general plans. But it was just the Commission's vision, how things could look like. And in the last months, what we've seen is a call for evidence and a public consultation with a specific questionnaire for the certification mechanism. It closed on the 2nd of May, and you'll be able to read many of the contributions on the Commission's website. The questionnaire itself had many good questions and choices, and showed like the depth of consideration around how to design the certification framework. Now, the results of this will feed into the impact assessment, which then will feed into the legislative proposal itself that we are expecting sometime towards the end of this year. Those who are working on policy every day already know it, but for many, sometimes it comes as a surprise that when the Commission publishes a proposal, it doesn't mean that now we have the legislation. It actually starts the process of negotiating the legal text, and that will then lead into the actual final version of the certification mechanism. So there will be the Commission and the EU member states and the European Parliament discussing it in the complete granular detail, and they will agree on the text, and then we'll have the operational certification framework. I would expect to take it a couple of years, so hopefully we'll have it in 2024 or 2025. What will also happen meanwhile is a Commission will establish an expert group that will also feed into the development of the certification framework. I don't know when exactly they plan to establish this group. I hope they will do it over the summer at least, because there is not that much time left actually. If the proposal is out by the end of the year, they need all the input they can get as soon as possible. So this is my last slide, where I just combined some policy challenges that I think are most relevant when we talk about CDR policy. On the highest level, there is a general lack of detail on the role of CDR. So it's mentioned that it's needed, but how much of it is needed, what kind of residual emissions we're actually aiming for that we need to balance, and then, then we need more removals to go to net negative. What kind of sectors need to completely decarbonize, and what kind of sectors will be allowed, and which amount of residual emissions. This is an important conversation to have. There are a few examples where this is actually happening, but more broadly, it's really lacking and we need it. The second problem is that the policies don't really recognize the breadth of CDR methods. Big part of it is because we've had reforestation and afforestation, yes, for a long time, but now there are increasingly more novel CDR methods, and I'm sure that will just continue happening. There's a lot of innovation happening in this space, and a lot of that is just not part of the climate mitigation conversation at the moment. Partly because of the third bullet, but because we don't have monitoring, reporting, verification, and accounting rules in place for many of these methods. And we need to fix it. And the certification mechanism, for example, that the European Union is working on could help a lot here. If it's done well, it could serve as a blueprint for other countries and regions. I'm really hoping for it. But currently, there are clearly gaps in there. And what is also important to bear in mind is that the thinking is often, well, we'll take the policies that have worked well for reducing emissions and we'll kind of apply the same thing for carbon removals, and that will work. But carbon removals take everything we know on emission reduction policies and then some, because there is a question around durability, for example, that we haven't had to grapple with on designing emission reduction policies, but that is very, very important when we talk about carbon removal. So it's, you know, we need to really design like specific type of policies, and we have to have these tools in place that work specifically for CDR and that can help to scale it up in a really robust and meaningful way. And then, of course, you know, research and development, innovation, commercialization, all the financing streams that also can come from the policy tools are needed, and we need them specifically for CDR so that we don't have the competition of emission reduction and CDR from the same pots. Like, we need both, right? But it's very useful to be CDR specific. And last but not least, very important also to consider the whole do no harm concepts and all the negative potential externalities in deploying different CDR methods. There's just so many different types and in so many different sectors, and this it will look very different for all CDR methods. And obviously, when we talk about the deployments, also the aspects of climate justice always need to be respected. So I have, I think, done quite well with my 20 minutes, slightly over. I will stop here and hoping for a set of interesting questions.
Thank you very much, Eva, for your input. And you can see Eva's contact details, or you could see them on the screen. So there are a few questions in the chat. There's also possibilities to ask questions. And as before, I will take the privilege to ask the first 1 or 2 questions before we open up. So Louis showed us before some options, like just very briefly, how policy design for different regulations of markets could look like between regulation and voluntary compulsory market, etc. You've also talked about that. If you had to be a bit bold and guess where you think it is going for the European Union and the European markets, what do you expect these markets to and regulation to look like in 5 years, maybe, or 10 years?
So in the European context, so is your question more about how the voluntary and compliance markets will evolve in Europe?
Yes, and also how they will be, how they will, what you expect actually to happen. Like you showed us a lot, like what's currently happening and what the challenges are, but what would you guess where it is going? So
if the certification system actually is put in place and starts working, and I'm sure it will start working in phases. So in the beginning, there's going to be certain CDR methods, and then there's going to be piloting and learnings, and will include others, and it will always happen in phases. It will definitely be used to leverage voluntary market, because there's just so much interest in there, and there's so much demand from corporate buyers for it. And I'm very sure that this exercise will feed into compliance markets for policy in general through, for example, the accounting rules that we currently don't have, but we have something that is not as good as we need. So I expect that some learnings from that will be taken over from like the real policy making, and for the possibly sectoral policies, or maybe there's going to be specific targets for carbon removal, for example, in Europe. Well, there is already something, but we would like to have also targets for technology-based removals. I mean, I don't like to use nature versus technology, but I still have, because I know it's not a great concept, but I'm still finding the best way to explain things with different words. So I'm still using it. I also use it on my slides. And I think if Europe is able to figure out a meaningful way to account for these new CDR methods, that should then feed into also the international accounting rules. So the national greenhouse gas inventories and the IPCC guidelines. That is a very slow process, but it will need to catch up because CDR is moving fast and we need to be able to account for that. So that's something that I see happening, or at least I hope I will see happening.
Thank you very much. Maybe just a short comment on the natural and technological solutions. In the latest IPCC, for those who haven't seen it, they've abandoned, I think, these categories, and there's nice new categories based on like where it is stored or how it is stored, etc.
Yes.
Very worth figure to look at.
Yes. So actually, the background of it is they also didn't have it in the previous report, but no one bothered with the 1.5 degree report because the definition was there. It was the same. Now the same definition is in a new report, and everyone is like, "Oh, we have a definition." Well, we already had it since 2018.
Yes,
and
it needed time.
Yeah, and this concept of where the CO2 is coming from and where it is going, it was also there in the previous, I think, 1.5 degree report. It didn't get any traction. Now it's getting more traction. And I'm still struggling to find the right words to make like an easy way to distinguish between the CDR methods. You know, for presentations and speaking, it's easy when you can write long sentences, but Definitely. For this purpose, it's a challenge. So
there's been some questions on double counting, and in the context of Article 6.2 in the chat, I'll try to, or I'll just read them to you. So the one question is like, if you could share insights on corresponding adjustments, I think to or in reaction to Article 6.2, considering considerations by the European Commission, especially on this, but also your perspective. For example, if the technology named here is biochar bags, afforestation, reforestation, if there's possible double countings. Yes, I think you've got enough keywords.
Well, just taking a step back. So the EU's climate targets are domestic, so they don't intend to use international credits. But of course, the EU member states, where they go beyond their contribution to the EU's targets, they can choose to use international credits. So sometimes, you know, it's kind of blindly said that the EU will not use any international credits. Yes, EU as such, as an EU will not, but its member states are planning to use, you know, Sweden is a good example for it. So the double counting can be an issue if you have the more than one country or entity claiming the same emission reduction or removal. It's not a problem if it's done within the same country. Like if you have a corporation in Germany using a credit for their net zero claim, and then you have Germany reflecting the same in their inventory, that just makes perfect sense because it's all about, it's just Germany. It's becoming more problematic if it's happening in separate jurisdictions. And in terms of double counting, the thing is that it's for the countries to choose which kind of activities on the voluntary markets they want to have the right to rubber stamp or to authorize or to require corresponding adjustment for. And it's yeah, I don't know how deeply to go into this because there are so many CDR methods that are not currently reflected in the national inventories. So if countries would actually require corresponding adjustments for those, then they would kind of bite their hand twice, because on one side, they never get to show the, you know, the removal in their inventory because they don't account for that. And then they would revise their inventory upwards through the corresponding adjustment for something that they cannot count anyway. So that doesn't make sense. But as the accounting rules evolve and we'll be able to account for more types of removals, that will become more of a thing. So that was kind of a removal specific answer.
Thanks. So now I'll try to summarize some questions that touch upon different methods. You'll have to see what you're comfortable answering regarding specific CDR methods. I'm sometimes of the impression that for different countries, there's different methods that are trending, so to say, in policies, but also in the public debate. For example, through climeworks in Switzerland, there's a lot of talk about DACs and whether there should be storage in Switzerland or abroad. I mean, it's still a small community discussing this at the moment, but it will grow probably. In the USA, also DACs are quite famous, and as you mentioned, in Scandinavian countries, specs sometimes are quite famous. So one question here was also with the context of do not harm, and the trade-offs of BECS regarding food and fuel and land use, etc. How do you feel the music in the EU and at the EU level is there? I will also add another question on methods. On your shortlist, there was also CCS and CCU. So the differentiation here, because not there's also BECS on the list, so not all CCS is counting to camera moves as far as I'm aware of. So if you could say a few words on how this ended up on the shortlist and what do you make of that? And let me quickly check whether we've got another question on methods. I think for the double counting you've answered already. Yeah, so leave it with that.
Yes, so for the countries and what they choose, it really depends on the country. And something I also mentioned when I talked about the markets, that's the best reason, like why we need to have carbon markets. It's not the one thing that will make certain CDR methods happen or certain emission reduction solutions happen, but it will facilitate in the situation where you have countries that have good access to geological storage. You have countries where you have a lot of certain types of forests or certain types of soils, certain types of feedstock that you can make biochar from. It's just all the countries will have different capacities to deploy different types of CDR methods. I think they should look very seriously what makes the most sense for them and put efforts there. And obviously, you know, the corporations that are active in countries, they will have an impact on what the countries choose to consider. But in more general, it also has a lot to do with geography and climates, because there's just so many, like who has access to ocean, you know, it's very, very broad. So yes, you can kind of say that some methods are more, I don't know, famous in some parts, but I think it's a really evolving place, because currently is the time to do a lot of capacity building with policymakers to educate them about all these different CDR methods, and that work will continue because new methods will come up in some of the CDR methods. Even when you talk about direct air capture, it's a world of its own because there are so many different types of it. So yeah, this work will need to continue. On the list that I showed, yes, it includes CCS and CCU, and it is a bit surprising. It comes from the fact that, so this slide reflected what this consortium that is working with the European Commission, that is helping the Commission to prepare the proposal, the background work that they are basically doing. So that's from their reports. When the Commission was looking for this consortium, when they were opening the tender, then in the tender document, they listed that the consortia will have to look at certain types of CDR methods, and they included CCS there. So there was no way for consortia to apply for it and win without looking at CCS, which obviously is not CDR. I think it has been highlighted a lot also after, again, seeing it in this report. I think it's, I wouldn't put any fault on the consortia themselves who prepared the report, because they are preparing what they're being requested to prepare. And they also mention that it's not CDR, but they mention it because they've been asked to. But I think it's a good question to always point to the Commission, because it is confusing. And I'm surprisingly still seeing so much confusion between people mixing up CCS and CDR, and this does not help. That's all I can say. Like we need to get it fixed. Hopefully, I mean, I think there's no way that the proposal itself is going to include CCS. The stakeholders will make sure, and the member states and the parliaments. But in general, we shouldn't talk about point source CCS when we talk about CDR, unless it's BECS.
Thanks. Yes, and at the same time, we have to remember that people who are not full-time working on the topic can be overwhelmed by the abbreviations, and we need to keep this discourse accessible to those because we need them. There was this question about, like, maybe if you answered it already a bit, but on how the EU mood regarding BECS is at the moment.
Yes, BECS. I'm not aware of a specific mood. I know that because the climate models used to, well, they still show a lot of role for BECS, right? So a few years back, I did have conversations where I heard, well, we do this and then BECS will take care of the rest. I think things have evolved since then. And I do hope that the way BECS will be deployed in Europe, that will have specific safeguards against all these negative externalities. And it's only done in situations where it makes the most sense from carbon removal perspective, from the life cycle assessments angle, and really like drawing the borders of that assessments as wide as possible.
Thank you very much. So I don't see any more raised hands. It's 5 to 6. I would like to thank you again also for your speed and flexibility in fixing the technical problem, which is something that can always occur. As I said before, we intended to have the order the other way, to have more first the broader policy input by Eve and then the climeworks perspective by Louis. For the last few minutes, I want to give Louis and Eva the chance, if you have any comments or questions to each other, to give you the stage. And then we'll close at 6 o'clock sharp.
Maybe I can open with a quick comment on what has been just discussed before on CCS and CCU within the EU CRCM. And we have also obviously seen that emerging and over the time coming back and being out again. And in the latest consultation, there was no CCS and no CCU included. So I hope that this is final and the final decision. But yeah, I could be that it makes its way back in. But as of now, I don't think that the EU is looking at that anymore. And maybe another comment on the double counting and Article 6 and corresponding adjustments and the like. I think when we speak of all these issues, they are great problems and we need to control them, but I think they can be controlled. But I think what also needs to be done is really just to build up a registry of how much is actually being captured and stored. And this was also a key insight from the communication on restoring sustainable cycles, that basically this monitoring infrastructure that is independent of subsequent use, but just the physical underlying structure of what is being stored, that's also highly needed. And I think once we know that, the way to maneuver around how to correspondingly adjust will be a lot easier. And it's key to not conflate the two, because we need a form of registry that even if there is some double accounting and double use even, or double accounting on national and international registries, that's not the worst, given where technology is and how we need to move and incorporate new solutions. We need to learn a lot more and no better way than an overall registry. And then the subsequent question of how they are being used and traded, that's more complicated, obviously, but it should rely on that first registry.
Thank you very much for these comments on the discussion. Any closing words from you, maybe Eva? Otherwise, I have to do that.
Well, I can just say that I'll highlight what I said on my last slide, that we need to have an agreed clear role for CDR when we talk about the policy. So I'm the policy expert, so I keep focusing on the policy and not that much on some of the other aspects. And that is lacking, and we need to fix it. And I'm really, really looking forward to seeing what the certification framework will look like, because this can potentially help to show the way for the rest of the world how to get it done.
Thanks. And we will have a look at this webinar again and see what we can actually learn for Switzerland, being a island inside the European Union and highly entangled. And thanks again, Evetame and Louis Uzo, for your very nice and insightful presentations and your nice answers to questions. And a big thank you to the audience for staying with us for 1.5 hours, bearing through the technical issues and asking your very well-informed questions in the chat. So with this, I close it and have a nice Tuesday evening, everyone.